Hi, everyone. Welcome back from your break. I hope that it was good and that you got to give yourself a little bit of decompression time from all these complicated times in which we live. We are going to be getting more into colonialism, and specifically, we're going to be talking about South Africa, which is really the superpower of Africa in many ways. It is Africa's most economically dynamic and powerful country, and has a lot going on there that's very interesting and a very, very dense and fascinating history that ties closely into colonialism from the last several hundred years. But first, I'd like to just go and touch base on some of the stuff that we already covered to review a little bit of what we had talked about with regard to the Congo, and specifically the Fahey Congo blog and the Congo Gold video that you watched. That's why we're starting out on this slide. So again, just to review and just to get ourselves back into remembering what was happening, the Berlin Conference was Africa's undoing in more ways than one. And so the colonial powers, they superimposed their domains on the African continent and the arbitrary countries that they created with no heed to the 1,000+ indigenous cultures and the history-rich distinct regions of Africa. So there were new borders that they made that divided up coherent political and social groups of people. They merged together different groups who really did not get along, did not belong together. And this is part of the point of how the colonists did it. It's a variation on the old Roman Empire tactic of divide and rule. In this, it was easier to control people in a region if they have a harder time getting along and working together to advocate for their own needs. So you put them into uncomfortable groups together, and they're going to probably fight with each other rather than fight whatever group from outside is pushing them together. Um, by the time Africa as a continent largely regained its independence and the different countries began to declare independence from the colonial powers by the late 1950s, the whole area had acquired a legacy of political fragmentation that couldn't be eliminated or made to operate satisfactorily. The African political geographical map is this permanent liability that was created. It resulted from a really short period of time, 3 months of ignorance, greed, and purposeful division that the Berlin Conference created during this pyramid when Europe searched for minerals, raw materials like rubber, and markets for industrial goods that Europe produced. It just became insatiable. It was too much for them to resist. Then the Congo, as we learned about this, was very stark, and the painful legacy of how colonialism impacts the region up through today. In the Congo video blog and critique that we talked about, right? We talked about how it's worth noting how the legacy of colonialism wasn't really discussed much, and there were a lot of issues with multiple civil wars on many fronts. There were different people in the classes who talked about this in different ways in the answers. So Yishi in period one put it saying that both pieces failed to mention the real reason why the civil wars and terrible systems began in the first place, show that they aren't being truthful to their audiences. Ethan Chen in period four said that without colonialism, the practice of putting people in labor for long hours, getting little to no compensation, would not have existed. If there hadn't been colonialism, I believe many people would be more like the Proverbs of the Congo in the way that they got along, more traditional ways of life based on local philosophies. And Shinshin, also in period four, noted that, quote, the boundaries of the Berlin Conference decided on forced different groups of indigenous people with their own cultures to live together, and this caused conflict. So it's really important to remember that colonialism in the Congo only ended 60 years ago in 1960, and the newly elected government was immediately displaced by actions from the CIA, the American Secret Service, and Belgium in the name of anti-communism. So the ongoing chaos and instability in the Congo is directly related to the legacy of colonialism and how it and the era following it stunted development. This became worse as the nation racked up international debt under corrupt leadership and constant internal conflict. Organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund forced the people of the country to undergo painful cuts in government services and low-cost sales of rights of its wealth to international corporations in order to finance structured payback of its debts, what they called structured adjustment programs. These created a lot of problems, and they continued, and they created the civil war situations that we hear about. In recent years, China has actually been stepping in with development projects. However, local workers are still underpaid and treated as second-class citizens in what has been called neo-colonialism or new colonialism, despite the fact that China is, in theory, a communist state that, in theory, believes in equality between workers. But that's a big question with regard to workers in Africa. So the legacy of and the fallout from colonialism lives on in the Congo. And this is a region that's still very rich in minerals and other raw materials. Western perceptions of this have increasingly grown ignorant to the structural problems that were set by colonialism. For example, there's a popular and critically acclaimed movie called Beasts of No Nation that dramatizes civil conflict in the region, but does not address the role of colonialism at all. Other regions of Africa suffered under colonialism, but for various reasons, they responded in different ways with different results, not all of which were bad. Over the next few classes, we will be studying the legacy of colonialism in another very important African country, South Africa. So first, let's do a quick review of two key types of governance that colonial powers used, that the colonizing powers of Europe used. Looking back at an older slide here, we're remembering direct rule as it was practiced by France, Belgium, Germany, and others. Do you remember that, right? So all the countries were directly owned and directly governed by European colonial governments. The language of the colonizer became the official language of the colony for trade, government, education, etc. The French colonies in particular, which were much of North and West Africa, as you can see here, so North Africa and West Africa cutting over to here, and parts of Central Africa as well. The people of these also the island of Madagascar was French colonized. The people of these colonized areas were also then considered to be direct subjects of France. But throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, to become an actual full citizen of the French Empire with rights as citizens of the French Empire, these subjects, these colonial subjects, had to be considered assimilated into Frenchness. So to pass a test, to do this, they had to pass a test that would require mastery of the French language, understanding of customs, and knowledge of French history, knowledge of institutions. This is a test that was nearly impossible to achieve without being educated in elite institutions in France. During this time period, about 6,000 of the French Empire's colonial subjects, that's to say 0.00016%, made the cut. The rest were definitely not citizens, and they had minimal rights under the French system and direct control. That said, there were many schools that were set up for education across France's colonies. This included education for many people in the working class and the middle class in these colonies. In contrast, the British Empire, the British colonies that were happening, they practiced what was sometimes called indirect rule over its colonies. Now remember, what was the big British colony that we looked at in the very beginning of this unit, where Sati was, right? What was that? Think about it for a moment. If you guessed India, you were entirely correct. As we learned in the reading on Sati, India, which was Britain's most valuable colony, was a prime example of this kind of indirect rule, which is to say controlling the colonies via installing local rulers and proxies who are obedient to Britain. The British would quickly suppress any resistance, and British company charters, sometimes the British government itself, but oftentimes they had big British companies that would be chartered by the government, be officially designated by the government to control resources. Effectively, they were big monopolies that controlled these countries by proxy. India was Britain's most valuable colony, and India is right over here to the east, kind of stretching down over here. And it was a prime example of this, starting in 1612 when the British East India Company began setting up trading ports with the blessing of the British government and local Indian rulers, who they kept well supplied with luxury British goods. By 1757, this powerful company had taken effective control of the vast majority of the entire Indian subcontinent. And they ruled it as a private colony under British laws and custom, with a private army that would number over 260,000 by 1803. That's twice the size of the British National Army, to whom control of India would eventually pass in 1858, when the country officially became part of the British Empire. So colonial subjects of the British Empire were definitely not citizens of the UK during the 1800s and the early 1900s. Rather, they were considered citizens of whatever colonial region they lived in, and technically under the rule of whatever local ruler Britain had approved of. A side effect of this is that it was sometimes hard for people, in particular missionaries who were concerned about human rights, to petition about what to do about these human rights abuses that they might have observed and who to talk to about that. Would it be the British government, a private company, a local government? It was oftentimes quite unclear. And that was, again, sort of by design. The UK did establish institutions for education in some of its colonies. Many of these were colleges. And mostly accessible, these are mostly accessible to a few thousand people in the middle and upper classes in these colonized societies who generally happen to be related or allied to the local ruling regime. Remember these local rulers and proxies. And many of these people made up essentially like local bureaucracies in different governments, government offices. But they were loyal to Britain. Um, when you're looking at the map here, you see a certain trend that they're trying to go for here. There's a little bit in the middle that's missing, right? But they're going for something very important, which is to say that they wanted easy access to colonial India, which is they was considered the crown jewel of the British Empire, where so many of Britain's exports and imports went. From Eastern and Southern Africa. So they wanted Cape Horn, which was down here in Eastern and Southern Africa, and up here to the Horn of Africa. And they wanted to have it control of the strategically important areas in Egypt, up here in North Africa, where the Suez Canal here, which they dug, would connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. So very, very important region for control here. And this was what they considered to be the Cape to Cairo strategy. So the Cape down here to Cairo in Egypt up here in the north. That was the British Empire's strategy, a collection of colonies. They almost succeeded through their control of Egypt, Sudan, which was Anglo-Egyptian Sudan down here in the south, Uganda down here, Kenya as well, South Africa, Zambia, and Botswana, which was Rhodesia, which was to be later to be named Zimbabwe. And the British also controlled Nigeria and Ghana over here, the Gold Coast region. So very, very important empires. The French and the British were the most dominant empires on the continent. So on prompt number 8, this is the next prompt I want you to do. I want you to think about how you're doing the prompts today. Consider what we just read and what we just talked about. So remember, when you're doing these prompts today, I want you to do at least 2 or 3 sentences for each prompt, as the prompts are your primary assignment today. That's what you're going to be doing. So the prompts, as you watch this slideshow, are going to be your primary assignment today. So think about this question. What type of colonial control do you think would be more effective? Direct or indirect rule? Explain why you think so from what we've just learned. Be specific and write at least 3 sentences for this, okay? Bear in mind here something very important. If you already jumped ahead and did this work, I'd like you to elaborate on it a little bit more given what you just learned about, because just the slides themselves aren't going to necessarily be enough here. So elaborate a little more, write a little more for me, okay? So pause your slideshow here and restart when you're done with the prompt. Okay, let's continue. So let's look at what we're going to be talking about here, which are the seeds of racism in South Africa. South Africa being a very, very important colony and future state in Africa and the economic superpower of Africa. So the primary questions we're going to explore over the next couple of classes are: why and how did the Afrikaner National Party create apartheid in 1848? And that was a separation of races. It was a policy called apartheid that dictated that black and white communities should live in separate spaces, travel in different buses, stand in their own lines. It was segregation. They introduced grand social engineering schemes such as forced resettlement of hundreds of thousands of people. It poisoned and bombed opponents, encouraged trouble in neighboring communities. It was a brutal system, an infamous legal code. We're going to look into how it came about and why it was enacted. We're also going to look at why did white South Africans tend to support racist ideas, how these ideas of white supremacy became so entrenched in colonial and post-colonial South Africa, a country that was at the peak of the white population, 85% non-white. So we're going to go into prompt number 9 very quickly here. We're going to be doing this as kind of a journal. We've looked at this definition before, and we're going to look at it more carefully now. Academics and experts who study racism often use the following simple definition. Racism equals prejudice plus power. What do you think this definition means? And how does it look on the interpersonal, let's just say person-to-person level, like between people? And how does it look on the structural and societal level? In other words, a whole society, including laws, customs, and practices. Please write at least one 3 to 5 sentence paragraph and try to use examples of this, okay? So we're going to pause. You're going to write this out. So pause and write this in your master classwork document. Okay, now that you've unpaused, just to discuss this for a moment, you will note that I said this is a definition that academic theorists on race tend to use. It factors in power. And just thinking about your answer and how this came down, just think about what power means. Power means a lot of things, but it especially means economic power, political power, and education. At the moment, standard dictionary definitions of racism often differ from this definition, though a key component in those definitions, the dictionary definitions as well, is a belief in racial superiority. Remember social Darwinism? The idea of justifying white supremacy through a perceived racial superiority of whites in particular. It is extremely difficult for individuals and particularly groups to feel, project, and most importantly, to impose onto others any self-declared superiority based on racial identification when the group that they are identified with is less powerful in a society overall than another dominant group. So it's really difficult for people who are not in a position of power, their group is not in a position of power, to project power from that group that would actually allow it to be defined as racism. So the academic and dictionary definitions in this are not so far apart. Also note that a feeling and projection of superiority, somebody projecting and enforcing the idea of superiority in a society in some way, it's not the same thing as a feeling of anger or resentment. So keep that in mind when you are judging whether something is racist as opposed to simply prejudiced or not. They are different. Just important to keep in mind. However you slice it, some institutions are fundamentally and inarguably racist. The apartheid system in South Africa was absolutely one of those institutions. It was designed to keep the black majority of the country entirely disempowered politically, economically, and socially. Before we get into apartheid, which is very much a legacy of the colonialist era, let's take a look at the history of South Africa going back well before Europeans showed up. So starting 170,000 years ago, yes, a long time, right? Where did human beings come from? We all originated in Africa. Our species originated in Africa. And one of the early places that human beings in their modern form as Homo sapiens went was the southern part of the African continent. So human beings have been present in South Africa for a very, very long time. From around 170,000 BCE to maybe around 400 CE, which is to say a hell of a lot longer than any of us can imagine in terms of time spans. The dominant culture of this region were what we would call hunter-gatherers. people who were making their primary living from hunting game and gathering wild plants as food. Not so oriented around farming or pastoralism, which is to say herding of animals. So these groups were, by the time we get into the historic period, they were groups such as the San, which is a kind of the broad term for these groups. They were known as that, and that include groups like the Kung, and yes, that is pronounced with clicking your tongue like Kung. Uh, they were the primary culture in this region, and you can see that they used a really complex language, and they still do. The people that still live in these regions. It includes extensive hand signing that you can see some examples of above, different clicks, different tones. It's a very complicated language. Um, about 3,000 of the San people remain living in traditional lifeways. It's about 3,000 people that still exist as hunter-gatherer people in these areas that are called bush people today. But between around 400 BC, CE, which is about 1,600 years ago, and 1,000 CE, which is around 1,000 years ago, there started to be some migrations from other parts of Africa into South Africa. So the Bantu people who were nomadic, they started to migrate to the Cape region. They were from areas including the Congo region. They ranged far and wide to find room to graze their cattle and to farm. The San people retreated to marginal areas, like kind of areas that were on the edges of the most fertile zones and the areas where it was best to graze cattle. They moved into more like semi-desert regions with a lot of hardy bushes and tough grasses that were hard to farm or graze in. That led to them being called bush people, because it was considered being out in the bush where there was a lot of hardy bushes. The Bantu, many of the San people also assimilated into Bantu society, or they began to adopt Bantu practices. So they would start forging iron themselves, or herding cattle or farming. So people adapted. Uh, there was some conflict for sure, and some people adapted, some people intermarried, some people decided to keep their traditional ways. Some societal change began. It was slow. It took place over around 600 years. So why do you think that the San way of life changed so profoundly when the Bantu arrived? This is prompt number 10. So remember, I want you to write at least 2 to 3 sentences for the prompts today. Go ahead and write about this. And pause. Okay, we are going to continue on. So the San way of life changed profoundly when the Bantu arrived. Of course, as we discussed, many of them may have assimilated or did assimilate at the time. There was definitely a change in lifestyle between these traditional ways of life. The Bantu kingdoms were actually quite powerful in much of Central and South Africa. And between 1000 CE and the 1650s, Bantu kingdoms actually controlled the region. So there's a major archaeological site called the Great Zimbabwe, which is a city. You can see a layout of it here. This is an archaeological map. It shows the different what they call complexes, which are different building complexes. This is the center of an empire, a trade center and a trade empire. So there was Mpumalanga and Great Zimbabwe, and they were flourishing between around 1000 CE and 1450 CE, so almost 500 years. These different kingdoms were doing great. Well, especially Great Zimbabwe was in those around 500 years. Had about 18,000 people at its peak. Had trade with China and India across the Indian Ocean. So boats would come in and out from over here, come this way. Across the Indian Ocean, there is a lot of Chinese pottery that's been found, especially in the Great Enclosure here. So there's obviously a great deal of trade going on. There are a few large kingdoms like these and hundreds of smaller ones. So here's some ruins and artifacts from Great Zimbabwe. This is a soapstone carving. Soapstone is a medium hard, beautiful, kind of silky but shiny, lustrous rock, jet black, that's used to carve very intricate stone carvings. Those are used as trade items. Also the ironwork that the Bantu did, and of course products from cows and agricultural products. This is Great Zimbabwe. You can see how big this is part of it. This is the central structure. This is a tour being led through it. These are some of the people walking around the outer walls. Um, Lots of iron tools and goods. Mampugabwe, which is a hilltop settlement, had produced luxury items and totems like this golden rhino that they have here, which is a really beautiful artifact that they've recovered from that. Um, Here's some examples down here showing what the typical architecture was, and actually in many of these regions still is for Bantu tribes people. Um, this is actually a photograph from relatively recent history, early 1900s. They're what they call wattle and daub houses. Wattle and daub are basically interwoven sticks that are then covered with mud and clay. So it's basically stucco. It's really good at controlling temperature for these different houses in hot climates. Also, lots and lots of ventilation. So, very effective type of housing for this sort of environment. The Mampugabwe hilltop site was near Pretoria, what's now Pretoria in South Africa. So then we're going into the colonial period. So there was this situation for a very long time, but starting in 1652, there began to be some changes. The Dutch settled at the Cape of Good Hope, which is this far southernmost tip, southwesternmost tip of South Africa. The Dutch settled here at the Cape of Good Hope. This was useful as a stopping point en route to India for the Dutch East India Company. So the Dutch were actually very, very successful in terms of being able to really get themselves into all these different ports around the world. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. The Dutch, by the way, are from the Netherlands, which is also called Holland. I know it's a little confusing, but again, the Dutch are the people from the Netherlands, which is also Holland, where Amsterdam is. It's a area in Europe right over here, right on the other side of England, next to Germany, next to Belgium, next to France. Fairly small country, but lots and lots of people using the water for all kinds of stuff. Lots of trading. They really had the jump on coastal colonization and control of ports, and they had that for quite a while since the 1600s. They did trade with the Khoikhoi, which were one of the San cultures who adopted pastoralism like the Bantu. There were copper, beads, and textiles, like finished European textiles. They were traded for meat, for cow hides, sometimes gold. So there was a lot of trade going on. Let's take a look at these guys. What do they kind of look like? Let's just looking at them for a second here, right? You can see a little bit in that picture, a little bit here too. Let's think about what they're looking like. So they're settling. They're settling rural farmers, which are called boers, along the coasts and rivers. So rural farmers from Holland, the Dutch. They started to battle the Khoikhoi and other native people over land, cattle, hunting resources. They're taking some of the nicer spots and they're taking control of them. And they have a very European idea of property where they own it and they control it. Very, very different. Um, so, you're looking at them here again, right? You're looking at this guy's picture. They're fortifying their settlements. They're building up forts, building up walls. Start to call themselves by 1700, about 50 years later, from when they started to call themselves Afrikaners, which is Dutch for African. So what do they look like? Here's really obvious, right? What do they look like? If you're guessing pilgrims, as in the pilgrims in the United States, or would be the future United States around the same time, 1600s, you would be right. They were Protestants. They were from different rural religious sects, Protestant sects, that were really into religious and cultural and racial purity. Uh, Control of the best resources for trade. They were into trade. And they were into separation from what they saw as supposedly corrupting influences of their neighbors, which was in Europe and also in Africa, even if that meant conflict. In the case of what would have been the United States, what would eventually become the United States, that would be conflicts between pilgrims and the Native Americans. Thanksgiving, which we know about as this peacemaking time, was the exception, not the rule. And in South Africa, that would be conflicts with the indigenous people who, naturally, wanted to be able to continue to use the resources and land that the Dutch colonists were now taking only for themselves. So, as such, the Boers were pressing inland. They had more fights with Native Africans. They began to enslave Native Africans. They prohibited baptism of or legal marriage with Native Africans for fear of giving them equal rights as citizens. So we are running into a lot of conflict here. Here's some vocabulary. These are important. Remember, all bears were Afrikaners, but not all Afrikaners were bears. So some of the Afrikaners lived in the cities and had different values. So Afrikaners were just Dutch settlers in South Africa. It's Dutch for Africans. These were white Dutch settlers in South Africa. Afrikaans was their language. It was the language of the Afrikaners. It was mainly Dutch, but it had a bunch of local changes to it that began and incorporated aspects of the indigenous languages and later English. It's a South African version of the Dutch language. So it's Afrikaans. And Bears were Dutch settlers in rural South Africa. It's Dutch for farmers. They were often devoutly religious. So not all Afrikaners were bears, though all bears were Afrikaners. Some Afrikaners lived in the cities, and these Afrikaners had different values than the bears. The more puritanical Afrikaners were the ones often going deeper into the countryside and identifying as boers, which means farmers. The Bear Nation revealed a distinctly Calvinist, which is a type of fundamentalist Protestant belief system, culture, and the majority of bears today are still members of a Calvinist sect called the Reformed Church. The Calvinist influence remains in many bears who see their role in society as abiding by the national laws and accepting calamity and hardship as part of their Christian duty. So these things are important parts of bear and part of Afrikaner identity. So now thinking about this prompt, number 11, why do you think the Dutch colonists decided to call themselves Afrikaners, which is to say Africans? Think about that for a moment. Prompt number 11, why do you think the Dutch colonists who were white decided to call themselves Afrikaners? Writing at least 2 to 3 sentences, please, and pause. Okay. Remember, we're in a situation where Europe is very unsettled and a lot of people are trying to move around and migrate to different places, which was starting to drive colonialism. But it was also driving how power was all jumbled up in Europe. And when we think about how a bunch of white colonists were starting to rebrand their identity and calling themselves Afrikaners, taking on an African identity to maybe some of you guessed that they were trying to separate themselves from Europe. That might be part of the reason for it. It also might tie into the fact that they wanted to establish their control over those resources. There's a lot of potential reasons. But one way or another, Europe was kind of a mess. This was after the French Revolution. And the power was all jumbled up in Europe. The Dutch East India Company, which was the inspiration for the British East India Company, and it started in the 1650s, had been losing power and market share to Britain for a few decades in and around Asia, Africa, and India. So Britain fought some successful wars against Holland, against the Netherlands in the late 1700s, and that sealed the fate of the Dutch East India Company, which was kind of reliant on the country of Holland. Still, in a bid for peace and unification against Napoleon, the British gave control of the Cape back to the Dutch. So this timeline here is that in 1795, Britain, as part of its wars against Holland, began the first occupation of the Cape. 1798, the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt. And in 1803, the British gave the Cape back to the Dutch under the Treaty of Amiens. However, the power shifted in Europe again. So, boom, there goes the Dutch East India Company logo. And let's see what we have here. We have the treaty being broken in 1806. So what ended up happening is the British came back and they retook the Cape. They broke the treaty at the close of the first Napoleonic Wars. Holland lost big. Britain was still not conquered. So, like the Dutch before them, and Napoleon wasn't really all that into colonies, especially after the mess that he dealt with in Haiti, right? So, like the Dutch before them, the British initially had little interest in the Cape Colony. They thought it was a strategically located port. But, they were there and they had it. And it's one of their first tasks. They tried to resolve a troublesome border dispute between the Bears and the Xhosa, which is one indigenous nation on the colony's eastern frontier. In 1820, the British authorities persuaded about 5,000 middle-class British immigrants, most of them involved in quote unquote in trade, to leave Great Britain and settle on areas of land between the feuding groups with the idea of providing this buffer zone. The plan was extremely unsuccessful. And within 3 years, almost half of these 1820 settlers retreated to the bigger towns, especially Grahamstown and Port Elizabeth, to pursue the same kind of jobs in trade and business and government that they had in Britain. British law began to be enforced. Some political rights were given to black Africans, and these English-speaking British settlers, as they moved back into the cities, they started to get the good jobs, which would do what to Afrikaners? Yes, you're right, displace them from their jobs. Of course, black people from South Africa were not getting these jobs to begin with. But more Afrikaners began to move to the country and becoming bears in the countryside. Patterns soon emerged. English speakers became highly urbanized. They dominated politics, trade, finance, and manufacturing, while the largely uneducated bears were relegated to their farms. Then in 1833, a very important thing happened. Slavery was outlawed in the British Empire, and this angered the Afrikaners. They had different ideas about slavery and colonial race power relations. Remember, there is also indirect rule. The Dutch had more direct rule over their colonies, different kind of rulership. The gap between the British settlers and the Boers further widened with the abolition of slavery in 1833, and this move the Boers generally regarded as against the God-given ordering of the races. They believed that the races were ordained in their positions by God, which is tied into all this social Darwinism and other issues. However, the British settlers' conservatism, they're still pretty conservative. Stopped any radical social reforms, so they weren't giving jobs to black South Africans who were from there. And in 1841, the authorities passed a Masters and Servants Ordinance, which essentially cemented that positions should go to white people, and it perpetuated white control, even though slavery was outlawed. So going on to prompt number 12. Why do you think the British outlawed slavery in their colonies and gave more political rights to black South Africans? Why do you think the British outlawed slavery in their colonies and gave more political rights to black South Africans? 2 to 3 sentences at least, please. Pause. Okay, coming back. However you may see the answer to this question, and whatever the reason or whether it was genuine, the perceived racial liberalization of the British led to many Boers fleeing deep into the countryside. They became voortrekkers, which is a word for pioneers. The British proclamation of equality of the races really angered them. And these voortrekkers, were also unhappy with the process of payment of compensation for slave owners whose slaves had been freed. They were pretty mad about that. Many of them had been slave owners. Beginning in 1835, several groups of Boers, together with a large number of Khoikhoi and black servants, Khoikhoi were one of the groups, the indigenous groups, they actually decided to trek off to the interior in search of greater independence. They weren't necessarily going together, but they were all moving out into the countryside at the same time. So between 1833 and 1840, it began what was known as the Boer Trek, or the Great Trek, De Groot Trek. The Boers moved into the interior to get away from British rule, language, and their perceived racial liberalism. And as you would expect, these voortrekkers began to intrude on indigenous lands, the Xhosa and the Zulu, to the northeast. So lots of problems here, starting. North and east of the Orange River, which form the Cape Colony's frontier, these voortrekkers found vast tracts of apparently uninhabited grazing lands. It seemed to them that they had entered into the promised land, with space enough for their cattle to graze and their culture of anti-urban independence to flourish. Little did they know what they had found, which is to say deserted pasture lands, disorganized bands of refugees, and tales of brutality, actually resulted from the Difakane, which was a very recent series of wars between neighboring indigenous groups and the newly unified indigenous Zulu Empire between 1815 and 1840, rather than representing any sort of normal state of affairs in these regions. So these lands are normally very much occupied, but the Bears had good timing to move into them when they were in dispute. So there's a lot of issues that they were potentially running into. Here comes some more pictures of them getting stuck in the mud. Just remind you of Oregon Trail a little bit, maybe. Well, they saw themselves in similar terms to the Great West pioneers in the United States. And like the Western pioneers, they had similar dynamics of warfare and conflict with indigenous groups. In particular, there was a very organized empire called the Zulu Empire that had been recently unified by Shaka Zulu, the king of all Zulus from 1818 to 1828. In particular, these wooded valleys that they had in Zululand, which was further to the north, proved a pretty darn difficult proposition for them to invade and take over than the temporarily vacant plains. So the Bears met strong resistance, and their incursions set off a series of skirmishes and treaties that would litter the next 50 years of increasing white domination. They clashed with the Zulus over land during this great trek, and the Zulus controlled this territory with King Dingane, who was Shaka Zulu's brother. He actually was, he had unified, well, Zulus had been unified by Shaka Zulu in 1818. And in November 1837, Dingane met with Pete Retief, leader of the Voortrekkers. In return for their recovering some stolen cattle, Dingane signed a deed of cession of lands written in English to the Voortrekkers. It's still an open historical question as to whether Dingane knew what he was signing, as he did not have any formal education and could not have read the contents of the document nor understood the concept of permanent land ownership because it wasn't a custom of Zulus to permanently assign land to individuals. However, he still had an idea that there were some issues with the Voortrekkers and the Bears taking over large areas of this indigenous territory. And on the February 6th of 1838, after 2 days of feasting, the chief had the diplomatic party killed. There are about 70 of them. And they'd been told to leave their firearms outside the military camp. And they were celebrating with dancing. When the dancing reached a frenzied climax, King Dingane leapt to his feet and shouted, "Bambani Abathakaki," which is "catch the wizards." And Retief and his men were killed. It's alleged that the reason why they were killed was that they withheld some of the recovered cattle. But the general historic opinion is that Dingane did not wish to actually yield the land ceded to them in the treaty, and he mistrusted their presence, to whom he wanted to send a very strong message of stay out. Bear outrage, as you would expect, mounted over the incident, and attacks on both Zulus and Bears intensified, with a decisive battle coming on December 16th, 1838, at the Nkome River. The Bears established a defensive enclosure, basically a circle of wagons, where they were hiding behind hay bales, fortified hay bales for defenses, shooting outward at the Zulu forces as they attempted to breach the circle. The Zulus did not have many guns, more arrows and spears. Only 3 Bears suffered injuries, but they killed about 3,000 Zulu warriors using 3 cannons and an elephant gun along with other weapons. 3,000 were killed of the Zulus, and only 3 Bears were even injured. It was a big loss for the Zulus. So much blood there reportedly caused the River Nkome's waters to run red, and the clash is historically known as the Battle of Blood River. In 1833 to 1840, this great trek was continuing. The Voortrekkers continued their they created 2 Bear republics, the Orange Free State over here and the Transvaal. So the British began to annex the Zulu area in 1843 and founded their new Natal colony at present-day Durban, which is here on the coast. Most of the Bears, like the Zulus, feeling increasingly squeezed between the British on one side and the indigenous African populations on the others, they began to push further north. So there were some issues. The British, in the meantime, were going about establishing large sugar plantations in Natal. And they annexed it, and they found few inhabitants of the neighboring Zulu areas willing to provide labor for them. They refused to work for the British. So in the 1860s, the British brought a whole bunch of indentured servants, which are basically contract slaves, from India. Slaves for a certain period of time until their contract is up. Zulu men refused to adopt the servile position of laborers, continued to, and over 300 300 Indian laborers came on board. It was just the beginning in 1860. And over the next 50 years, 150,000 more indentured Indians arrived, as well as numerous free passenger Indians, building the base for what would become the largest Indian community outside of India in the world. As early as 1893, when Mahatma Gandhi, as in Gandhi, arrived in Durban, Indians outnumbered whites in Natal. Meanwhile, the Bears began mining, and as you would expect, it's going to create lots of new issues. In 1869, gold was found in the interior. In 1870, diamonds were found in the interior. So we are running into issues here. Um, Meantime, in stepped a very important figure. We're coming near the end of the lecture here, but we're going to talk about Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was the dominator of this area of Africa. He was the real believer in Cape to Cairo, a British businessman and founder of the De Beers Diamond Company. Uh, Today, they still market 40% of the world's rough diamonds. At one time, they marketed 90%. An ardent believer in British colonialism, he firmly believed the British Empire should rule the entire world. Social Darwinist, unabashed white supremacist, particularly fond of white people from Britain. He carved out the southern African territory of Rhodesia for himself, later to become Zimbabwe in 1879 or 1979. He named Rhodesia after himself in 1895. He used his wealth and that of his business partner Alfred Bate and other investors to pursue his dream of creating a British empire in new territories to the north by obtaining mineral concessions from the most powerful indigenous chiefs. Rhodes' competitive advantage over other mineral prospecting companies was his combination of wealth and astute political instincts, also called the imperial factor, as he used the British government. He befriended local representatives of the British government there, the British commissioners, and through them he organized British protectorates over the mineral concession areas by separate but related treaties. He obtained both legality and security for his mining operations. Then he would win over more investors. Imperial expansion and capital investment went hand in hand. As you can see from this quote, we must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies. The colonies would also provide a dumping ground for the surplus goods produced in our factories. Cecil John Rhodes. This imperial factor was a double-edged sword. He did not want the bureaucrats in the colonial office in London to interfere with the empire in Africa. So he was on a collision course with Britain. He wanted British settlers and local politicians and governors to run it. He was also on a collision course with British missionaries who favored what they saw as the more ethical direct rule from London. So Rhodes won out because he would pay to administer the territories north of South Africa with a guarantee against his future mining profits. The colonial office just simply didn't have the funds to do it. Rhodes promoted his business interests as in the strategic interest of Britain, preventing the Portuguese, the Germans, and the Bears from moving into South Central Africa. His companies and agents cemented these advantages by obtaining many mining concessions, and this is a really big deal. So the British, operating largely in the interest of Rhodes' business ambitions, confronted stiff resistance to their encroachments from the Zulus. And this is a nation with well-established traditions of waging war. They used force to gain control over the gold and diamond sources, both from the Zulus and the Bears, and they ended up using cheap black labor from different areas in South Africa in the mines, bringing them in, which angered the Bears because not only were they getting the mines taken away from them, they were also not even being employed in the mines. Here's an illustration of the Kimberley diamond mine in the 1870s, which was a very dangerous place to work. All kinds of problems. They were what they called open pit mines, digging deep into the countryside. People would fall and die constantly. Very, very dangerous. So the British were running into this resistance of the Zulus, who were a nation with well-established traditions of waging war. They inflicted one of the most humiliating defeats on the British Army at the Battle of Isandlwana. This was the Zulu-British War of January-August 1879. In this very decisive battle, at first, the British lost with 1,400 soldiers killed. Major, major loss. This is also the last British preemptive war that they waged until the Iraq War. So the British, of course, decided to come back from this, and they ended up sending 40,000 reinforcements. So these 40,000 British reinforcements were sent, and the British won big. They brought big new weaponry, including early machine guns and big cannons. Zululand came under British control. They captured King Shetwashayo. They ended the war and established their control over it. And it's then now today known as KwaZulu-Natal province. Zulu men at this point began to work at the British mines, largely under threat of force. Meanwhile, Rhodes wanted to expand the British Empire because he believed the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to greatness. In his last will and testament, he said of the British, "I contend we are the finest race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence. Look again at the extra employment a new country added to our dominions gives." Wow, yeah, quite a supremacist here. He became prime minister of the British Cape Colony in 1890. He dialed back political rights for non-whites. Um, he wanted to make the British Empire a superpower in which all the British dominated countries in the empire, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Cape Colony, would be represented in the British Parliament. He included American students as eligible for the Rhodes Scholarships. He said he wanted to breed an American elite of philosopher kings who would have the United States rejoin the British Empire. As Rhodes respected the Germans and admired the Kaiser, he allowed German students to be included in the Rhodes Scholarships as well. He believed that eventually the United Kingdom, including Ireland, the USA, and Germany together would dominate the world and ensure peace. Please note, this was for white students and dominators only, in his view. Um, he wanted to create a secret society that would bring the whole world under British rule. So this is the final prompt. It's actually not number 12. My apologies. This is prompt number 13. So changes number 13. How did Cecil Rhodes' methods contrast with the standard British policy of indirect rule in their colonies? Why do you think Britain was okay with what he was doing? Prompt number 13. How did Cecil Rhodes' methods contrast with the direct British policy of indirect rule in their colonies? And why do you think Britain was okay with what he was doing? Give this at least 3 sentences. This is all you'll be doing for today. Thank you very much for paying attention, and I'll see you later on this week.